There are certain times when you go into a genre film and what you're expecting and what you actually get turn out to be two very different things, completely different things sometimes. And for me, going into this movie, Deep Rising, that was definitely the case. I was not expecting to have anywhere near as much fun with this movie as I did. I watched it twice in the space of 2 days, and I thoroughly enjoyed it on both occasions. I went into this movie having not much of an idea of what to expect. I often look up certain movies, especially when I've got a few recommendations on the channel, and then I look for similar movies on Google, but I don't really look at the write-ups or reviews that much, if at all, and then I see if I can find those movies for good prices on Amazon or eBay, and try and pick them up to watch and review. That was the case here. I didn't really look into what it was about, I just had a very brief overview. But even then, I'd forgotten what it was about entirely by the time it actually got delivered and I sat down to watch it. Now, the first thing I'll say, and I don't know if this is the case for all versions of it, but the DVD box, which I bought it in, doesn't do it really any justice at all. It makes it look like just a forgettable B-movie knockoff, maybe even a parody. It's boring, frankly. It's a boring-looking box, and although, of course, in the grand scheme of things, that's not really important to a review, it's important to marketing. And that all adds up to, for instance, the fact that it only made $11 million at the box office from a $45 million budget. So, of course, marketing is very important, especially given that many of the creative minds and even the cast involved in this movie, such as Stephen Sommers, who wrote and directed it, were also involved in movies in the genre of this kind of action comedy with elements of horror, such as the Brendan Fraser Mummy films, or slightly less so, but still, the Scorpion King films as well. Those films are loved by many people. They have a special place in the heart of many, especially the Mummy films. This has some very similar elements to movies like The Mummy and The Mummy Returns. It's not the same story, of course not, but cast members are carried over. The guy involved in writing and directing it, of course, is carried over, and also, more than anything else, the feel and the style of those films is carried over, to the point where I would say if you dislike those Mummy films, or say something like The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, for instance, then you'll probably dislike this one too, because it has that same kind of vibe. Good production values, very well known, very impressive casting, but a story which knows what it is. It has a thick layer of cheese, but it's all the better for it. It goes with it, it runs with it, the jokes tie into that, it's very self-aware as much as being a B-movie in effect, but also it's endearing all the time. And it's not endearing in a Attack of the Killer Tomatoes kind of way, it's just endearing as a good, fun film, just like the Mummy movies, as I've said. In fact, more so than anything else, this story really reminded me of The Mummy, the way it's carried out, the way the film is presented. But as far as the essential plot, and chances are if you're watching this review you probably already know at least something about it, is a massive luxury cruise ship is puttering along through the ocean, doing its thing, as you'd expect. People are having fun on there, spending extravagantly, people are luxuriously dressed, all that kind of usual stuff. And also, incidentally, the cast of extras in this film is massive. This is one of the biggest casts I've seen in a genre film. Alone, just the people on the boat are tons more than you would typically have in a horror action flick. Then, though, you have what is initially a side story, or it appears to be, of some guys, mostly mercenaries, on a small, almost reconnaissance-looking boat, who have paid the captain of the boat to do a mission which he's vague on. Basically, they want him to get them somewhere. He doesn't ask questions, he just wants to be paid for the job, and that's basically the opening salvo of the film. And the cast in this movie, as I already said, is massive. Extras alone is huge. But specifically, this was one of those movies which I went into, and because my expectations were virtually zero, I kept on actually audibly saying, whoa, he's actually in this, she's actually in this. I knew a couple of the people who were in the film, but it shocked me how many well-known faces and names are in this movie. Just listen to a few of the people who are in this film. You've got Treat Williams, Famke Janssen, Anthony Heald, Kevin O'Connor, Wes Studi, Derek O'Connor, Jason Fleming, Cliff Curtis, Clifton Powell, Trevor Goddard, Jimon Honsu, Una Damon. It's a massive cast, and many of these people went on to do things which they're known for far more, sometimes even Oscar level, for instance, and many of them ended up being in fan favourite films, genre films, even superhero films in some cases. And that's not just the case with Famke Janssen in the X-Men universe, but also, of course, Jimon Honsu in Guardians of the Galaxy. Many of these people have had very successful careers. Some not so much, but still they are recognisable faces. And it was so fun to keep seeing more and more of these people popping up in the film. So, as far as the essential story goes, I already touched on the opening, and that really is like the first 5 minutes of the film, what I mentioned basically. But the two mini-stories collide, as you'd expect them to, and the overall feel that I got from this movie in terms of style, as I said, was like The Mummy. But in terms of the actual plot, I would liken Deep Rising as a combination of the Poseidon Adventure and Aliens, with elements of other films in there as well, like Titanic, for instance, or The Beast, but more so than anything else, I would say Poseidon Adventure meets Aliens, very much so, with the cocky mercenaries going in there, the overwhelming numbers of the creatures, and also the location of the stranded ship, because of course it's not sinking in the same way as something like Titanic, just going straight down, because that would be a pretty short movie. It's more so like the Poseidon Adventure, where it lasts a while, and it takes a while for anything to happen as far as the location. So, going into that, I think that's a pretty cool concept, and it's a concept which certainly allows the film to be self-aware. It's not trying to be an Oscar-winning film. Of course not even close. It's just the potential for a whole lot of fun. And that is what I would say Deep Rising is. This movie is a whole lot of fun. I had a smile on my face for most of the movie, I laughed out loud plenty of times, and something which I don't talk about on this channel much is comedy. I often don't find modern comedies funny. My favourite comedy of all time is Uncle Buck. I prefer older comedies, the Airplanes, the Hot Shots Part 2, various others like that. Modern comedy just doesn't do it for me. It's too forced, it's too crass, but just for the sake of being crass, just not funny to me. Movies like this, though, it has a mix of dialogue-based humour, where it's the way things are said or the look on someone's face, and also there's some just silly, borderline slapstick stuff, which in this movie is appropriate. It feeds into, again, that cheesiness which the film inherently has. And I would say that there is a big difference between a cheesy film and a campy film. Often a campy film will be like a B-movie, whereas cheesy, a massive budget movie could even be cheesy. Something like Independence Day, for instance. It's got a layer of cheese there, but it's a well-loved film anyway. You can't deny that there are cheesy moments in Independence Day, and even the entire premise of it is cheesy to some degree, but it's still a good film. This, I would say, is in that same boat. It's not really campy, but it is cheesy for sure, and I think it's all the better for it. It's the kind of movie which feels like it's almost a parody of something, but that's the great thing, because what it's parodying doesn't exist. This is its own thing, but at the same time it feels like a parody, but not a parody of itself, which is good, because a lot of those parody comedies as well just aren't that funny. It's just reference after reference, and that's not what it is here. I, as you can tell, thoroughly enjoyed my experience with this film, and there are still certain things which I didn't like. The main one, I would say, that could have easily been far improved, but at the same time is certainly of its time, was the CGI on the creatures. It's horrendous. There's no way around it. It looks absolutely awful, totally unbelievable, and of the time, kind of like a PS2 or even maybe a PS3 cutscene, but that's being generous. But if you think about the guys involved, they did also make The Mummy, and remember how the Scorpion King looked at the end of that, so what do you expect? Of course it's not going to look that great. Plus, this movie, it's around 2 decades old now, so of course it's not going to look as good. So I can definitely forgive it for that. Plus, most of the great stuff in the story isn't even about the creatures, it's the interplay between the characters, and I love that. They're such a good cast, they don't even need to get along. Much of the comedy comes from the fact that they don't get along, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I love the chemistry, I love the casting, and also the production quality is so much better than many other genre films that it instantly gives you this feeling of that it's going to be a good journey, basically, that the film looks better, you can actually hear what people are saying, it's not grainy, not in a bad way, you know, older films should be, but you know what I mean, it's a good quality film in terms of the effort put into it. And I like that, I appreciate that, and it's all the better for it. So, with that all being said, what about individual scores? Because at the same time as loving it, I'm not claiming that this is the best thing ever, even for a genre film. Of course not. This is the kind of movie which is going to be more of a cult classic, which I'm sure it already is for some people, now myself included, and I'm very glad that I watched this movie because I didn't feel like doing so. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that the scores are necessarily going to be super high. So what am I going to give it? Well, first of all, we have, as always, the story and the plot. And for the story and plot, and some people will definitely disagree with this, I'm going to give it a 7. And that is very high, a lot higher than I was expecting to give it. And the reason why I'm giving it a score that's that high is because I believe the story was not just better than it easily could have been, because, let's be honest, it's a fairly simple plot, all things considered, but part of that score is always not just the essential plot and the story, but how that story is carried out, how it's told. And I think that although the essential concept of this one isn't overly complex, it's carried out in a very good way. And to me, it's carried out so well, with an excellent balance of action, comedy, and horrific elements, and there is some horrific imagery in it, that I'm going to give it a 7. I think it does it really well. It doesn't try to be overly complex or overly deep, but it does what it does very well. And go into it expecting action comedy more than horror comedy, because that is what it is more so. It's an action comedy, as I said, with elements of horror. As far as the characters go, well, some people probably aren't going to like this either, but I'm giving it an 8, because characters are something which I always appreciate in a movie. I love having a great cast with great chemistry. That's why some of my favourite movies include things like the original Manhunter movie, for instance, or 12 Angry Men, or The 13th Warrior, movies which, for the most part, aren't necessarily talked about all the time, but they have fantastic chemistry between the cast, and that is definitely the case here. The comedy is great, if you're into the kind of comedy, and just in general, even if you put the comedy to one side, it's a great cast. You cannot argue that. So, definitely an 8 from me. As far as the visuals, I'm going to give it a 6. And of course I did say that the CGI was pretty bad, so why am I rating it above par? Well, of course, because in a similar way to how the story involves more than just that, so do the visuals. The visuals isn't just about special effects, it's about the look of the film, the camera quality, the artfulness where necessary, or even visual comedy in the case of this one. That's why I'm giving it a 6, because the only thing, I think, about this movie which lets it down is just the CGI of the creatures. The sets are fantastic, the camera quality, the camera work is more than adequate, it's a good looking film. It's just the CGI. So I'd love to be able to rate it even higher. Were the CGI better, or were it done with some practical effects instead? Because it's pretty much entirely CGI when it comes to the creatures, if not entirely, then it would have easily been a 7, maybe even an 8. But it's not, so the score isn't. As far as the audio, the soundtrack, the theme tune where applicable, I'm going to give it another 6, because I didn't find the music great. It has some very notable music, especially towards the start, where you see the boat riding in, or driving in, or whatever you want to call it, piloting it in. But in general, it was good enough. Above par for the genre, yeah, sure. Nothing to write home about, but it was more than good enough. I like the soundtrack, but it was more so an action soundtrack. I would have appreciated some of the more, maybe horror elements being leaned into a bit more as far as the soundtrack goes, but again, it's not really that kind of film. As far as finally the fun factor, the rewatchability, both as an individual and as a group, I'm going to give it another 8. And that is a score which I have no qualms about whatsoever. It definitely deserves that as far as I'm concerned, but of course that is the most subjective score to me anyway. But even so, this is definitely a movie which is going to be a cult classic. It's already a cult classic, half the people who watch it probably won't care for it, half the people will absolutely love it. It's just that kind of film. And that's quite often the case, of course, in genre movies anyway. So if you do appreciate a good action comedy with elements of horror, again, similar in that way to Aliens, then yeah, check it out. It's nowhere near as horrific as many other movies which I review, but there is some horror imagery in there. Characters getting killed in certain ways, or the aftermath, let's say, of characters being killed sometimes, or extras being killed. So yeah, it has rewatchability for sure. As I said, I watched it twice in the space of 2 days, and I'll definitely watch it again. Great fun. By definition, it's a very fun film, and it is perfect for group party watching. If you fancy having a movie night with a group of friends, it's the kind of movie where if you pick up the dialogue, you'll have a good laugh, but you can also just laugh at the visuals, how bad the CGI is, but also how fun the movie is. So it's great. And overall, that does mean that I'm giving it a perfectly respectable score of all 5 categories combined of 3.5 out of 5, which isn't crazy high. Of course, I'm not going to give it a 4 or anything like that, but still, 3.5 is very good. That's certainly a lot higher than I was expecting that this film would get going into it, because I really didn't have any expectations. So yeah, certainly worth checking out. Not really as dark or as intense or as creepy as most of the movies which I review, but it's nice to have a change for a change. So if that sounds like it appeals to you, of course, check it out, and I'll see you guys next time. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.